Good morning, everyone. Welcome to White & Case and our, and I'll say it, I'll brag a little bit, our beautiful quorum space. It's really nice to have the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce here with us again for the fourth year. My name is Chris Hansen. I'm a partner in our asset finance group at White & Case. I also have the great privilege of being the head of our Latin American practice, which is made up of more than 275 lawyers scattered throughout about 30 offices around the globe. And these are folks who are almost entirely dedicated to doing work in the region. Obviously, we have a region-wide and a global practice, but Brazil holds a special place in the hearts of everybody at White & Case, and particularly those of us who practice in the region. We were one of the first international law firms to open up in Brazil 27 years ago, when my good friend and partner Don Baker went down as a pretty young associate and started the ball rolling for us. And during those 27 years, we've helped our clients navigate multiple complex matters and disputes throughout the region and into the U.S., right? We've actually done a lot of work for some great Brazilian clients doing very large investments in the U.S. over the years. In today's discussions in particular, we're going to explore the rule of law, shedding light on how a stable legal framework can attract and protect investments in Brazil, followed by a deep dive into the macroeconomic and political outlook for the country, giving us all some valuable insights so that we can continue to thrive and support economic development in Brazil and beyond.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. Chris, thanks very much for once again welcoming us here, to you and your team at White Case. We definitely feel at home here. It's probably one of the best meeting places that we could think of to have this discussion. Couldn't be more timely for us to get together here today to discuss Brazil 2025, but also discuss the United States and discuss the relationship of the two countries, the 200 years that we've had of working together and really seeing what we can expect. I think the panelists today are going to have a very challenging job to tell us what's going on and what's going to happen, because I think it could change during the panel what to expect. But I know that we're all very excited about hearing from such distinguished speakers. We at the Brazil Chamber really believe in sharing forums like this to have an open discussion about ongoing events and have hopefully come up with some ideas about how we can go on with our businesses and our lives in a thoughtful manner. Before we get going, I want to thank the team at the Chamber for once again organizing a great event. So Fernanda, Tatiana, Mauricio, Laura, and our dear Huchi, who's here, is always here. Thanks so much for once again organizing a great event.
Good morning, all. It's a very big pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Will, for this wonderful meeting. It is my great honor to introduce some words from our Vice President and Minister of the Industry and Development, Mr. Geraldo Alckmin. He reflects on the rich 200 years of history that Brazil and the United States have. He goes into the questions of trust and mutual benefits that we have enjoyed. He goes into history and he invites us to be creative and to be positive in these very different times. We are in the consulate we trust very much in this relationship. We work with it every day. We know that it's for the best of our two countries and for our two populations. Thank you very much. With you, Mr. Geraldo Alckmin.
Amigas e amigos, é uma grande satisfação me dirigir a vocês que participam da conferência da Câmara de Comércio Brasil-Estados Unidos deste ano. Agradeço por intermédio do meu querido amigo embaixador Adalnio Ganem, bem como ao Will Landers e ao José Roberto de Azevedo, que com grande zelo dirigem esta importante instituição, pela oportunidade de lhes transmitir uma breve mensagem. Este é um momento importante para reforçarmos os laços de amizade que há 200 anos unem nossos países. Ao longo de 2 séculos, Brasil e Estados Unidos, as duas maiores nações do nosso hemisfério, construíram suas próprias identidades, amparando-se na diversidade de seus povos, na riqueza de seus territórios e na capacidade de seus governos encontrarem oportunidades no exterior para atender às necessidades de suas populações. Compartilhando os valores da democracia e do Estado de Direito, fomentando o livre comércio e os investimentos recíprocos e defendendo instituições multilaterais que estimulam a cooperação entre os países. Avançamos muito ao longo do tempo. Temos orgulho de reconhecer a magnitude, a qualidade e o equilíbrio das relações econômicas construídas com nosso segundo maior parceiro comercial e maior investidor. E seguir esse caminho, em nossa visão, é trilhar a via da prosperidade compartilhada. Por meio de mecanismos como o Protocolo de Comércio e Cooperação Econômica entre nossos governos, integrado pelo Itamaraty-MDIC, e o Fórum de CEOs entre nossos empresários, queremos ampliar os negócios de lado a lado, utilizando nossa proximidade geográfica e nossas complementariedades para criar mais oportunidades para nossos empresários e trabalhadores. Nossas políticas industriais podem servir como plataformas de adensamento de cadeias produtivas em segmentos como siderurgia, mobilidade, saúde, mineração, transformação digital, energias renováveis e muitos outros. Além disso, essa integração produtiva pode ser complementada pela abertura de mercados em nosso entorno imediato e em outras regiões, aumentando nossas exportações. A redução de custos com reformas e políticas de desburocratização e digitalização de procedimentos, que no caso de nosso país fazem parte da agenda de enfrentamento ao chamado Custo Brasil. Podem, ademais, melhorar o ambiente de negócios, reduzindo, por exemplo, prazos para registro de patentes de produtos e ainda aprofundar nossa parceria em setores de ponta, como a emergente área da inteligência artificial. Com um diálogo transparente, envolvendo nossos governos e empresários, temos destacado o caráter mutuamente benéfico de nosso comércio de bens e serviços, onde os Estados Unidos são sistematicamente superavitários. Esclarecer dúvidas de nossos parceiros, identificar áreas de cooperação estratégica entre nossos países e impulsionar o aprofundamento da integração de nossas economias. Acreditamos ser, além do nosso dever, vias que convergem para o mesmo destino, o desenvolvimento conjunto. Contem conosco na Vice-Presidência da República, no Ministério do Desenvolvimento da Indústria, Comércio e Serviços. O café está no bule, ou como vocês dizem aí, the coffee is on the pot. Um grande e fraterno abraço.
Wonderful to be with you this morning. It's a pity I could not have joined in person. I hope to compensate in a couple of weeks when we will be in New York for the Person of the Year events. So greetings to you all. My friends, it's very difficult to look at Brazil-U.S. relations without understanding the bigger framework of the times we are living in. And I think it's particularly interesting to note that it's been exactly 20 years now, that a very famous book came out by the renowned New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, a book that I'm sure many of you have read. I'm talking here about The World is Flat. It seemed to me that 20 years ago, the perception was that international trade was going to become deeper and deeper. The flows of international investment would be flowing in a very free way. International cooperation was on the rise. It seemed to me that the world is flat was kind of a manifesto of deep globalization. If Thomas Friedman walked into the deep globalization airplane and then on into the cockpit, it was efficiency that was in command. It was all about efficiency. It was all about competitive advantages by establishing global supply chains. Now, if we take a time machine from April 2005 to today, 2025, you walk into that cockpit again. I'm not saying efficiency is not there. Efficiency is always very relevant. It's there. But there is something else in command. That's something else that's become very central. And that is the notion of geopolitics.
Thank you, Will, and good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. I have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Minister Bruno Dantas, and I couldn't really think of a better way to start off our panel on the rule of law and legal certainty in investments in Brazil than having him as our keynote speaker. Minister Dantas is the Minister of the Tribunal de Contas da União, TCU, and since 2024, he is the first Brazilian elected to United Nations Board of Auditors.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today with you in this very important summit. Rather than lecturing on concepts we all know, I'd like to speak frankly and concretely about how Brazil has been improving the legal certainty and quality of public investment, particularly through the evolving role of the Federal Court of Accounts, the TCU. Well, some of you may know at the TCU we have moved beyond the traditional paradigm of after-the-fact auditing, the post-factum auditing. Our focus today is increasingly prospective. We help shape the legal and economic architecture of infrastructure projects before contracts are signed. Capital is committed and risks are triggered. This includes detailed reviews of feasibility studies, demand projections, legal frameworks, pricing models, and risk allocation mechanisms. Our objective is clear: to ensure projects are bankable, legally sound, and socially valuable from day one. A prime example of this shift in our court and in the Brazilian history is the new public procurement law, the law 14,133. This legislation essentially codified nearly 30 years of TCU case law on procurement and public contracts under the law 8,666. It formalizes some tools we long advocated for, such as comprehensive planning and the use of risk matrices. These mechanisms are now embedded in the law, not just as best practices, but as legal obligations. Before, if someone wanted to draft a good administrative contract, they should follow the jurisprudence, the case law of the TCU. Now, it's not only a best practice, it's an obligation is in the law, the new law that is enforced since the last year. This institutional trust has also been reflected in other legislation. And here I should say there is a two-way movement. The TCU case law pushes the Congress into new legislation, and the Congress, very often, they empower the court with new functions according to our constitutional role, of course. And I must say, under the law governing early renewals of rail concessions, many of you may know, the TCU's prior approval is now mandatory. It was a bill presented to the Congress by former Minister Tarcísio de Freitas, and it was very quickly approved by the Congress to allow the renewal of rail concessions. And one of the main issues in this bill is the need of prior approval of the court. In a way, we will certificate the pricing is correct, all the assets are well priced. So we assess the economic soundness of these extensions before they are executed, ensuring that long-term commitments, often involving billions in capex, are underpinned by technical scrutiny and public interest alignment. For investors, this is not a hurdle. It is an independent validation of value and legality. Looking forward, we are closely monitoring the upcoming renewals of electricity distribution contracts, most of which will take place this year, 2025, and next year, 2026. These are essential assets for both investors and consumers in Brazil. Our role includes reviewing rebalancing clauses, tariff formulas, service quality standards, and the alignment between public goals in one hand and contractual incentives in another hand. Our focus is to guarantee that these renewals produce modern, efficient, and enforceable contracts. We have also created an institutional channel for resolving distressed contracts, the SESEX consensus. It is a very important tool I established during my chairmanship in the court, which ended in December. It was one of our biggest decisions. It means a shift on the look the court takes. Instead of looking a way to punish the public managers when they commit a mistake, we try to build together with them new and modern contracts, rebalancing the clauses and presenting these things to the society. We instead of letting failing contracts deteriorate into endless litigation and public losses, we've developed a transparent framework to renegotiate them responsibly. It has been the only effective solution to optimize projects that would otherwise collapse, hurting companies, hurting the state, and hurting the citizens. All of this has led to something quite revealing. More and more potential investors are seeking direct engagement with the TCU. We have welcomed many of them for technical meetings where they learn how we evaluate projects, which standards we apply, and how our review calendars are structured.
Whenever you talk about Brazil, you talk about risk. You talk about political risk, regulatory risk, legal risks, and so on. So with that, it comes the concept of legal and regulatory certainty. So we decided to, but it's usually very subjective. So people have different concepts and different ideas about legal certainty or legal uncertainty. So we decided to understand how could we measure that. Of course, it's very difficult to measure the reality of legal and regulatory certainty. So we decided to go through the idea of measuring the perception of that. We did a sample of 1,000 companies, and we were able to receive 350 answers from those stakeholders to understand how they feel about the legal and regulatory index. And the results were, I would say, predictable in terms of the negative approach that those stakeholders, usually people that work directly interacting with the public sector, mainly lawyers, vice presidents of legal, tax, or government relations of the biggest companies and law firms in Brazil. And I would say that the first results are very negative. I'm not sure if someone could pass. Oh, perfect. So we can go further to the main results. We actually realized that we didn't have a benchmark. We have like the World Bank index of doing business, and but not particularly about legal and regulatory certainty. So the first thing that we could manage is to find one number, and in a scale from 0 to 100, we realized that we have the perception that Brazil is like 35% positive in terms of legal and regulatory certainty. That doesn't mean that people basically, that the institutions are like objectively weak. That means that usually the approach that those professionals have in terms of expecting good results from the institutions in terms of certainty are, I would say, negative from neutral. This is also a very important point that we realize that as a starting point. So we know that it's difficult to say 35 is good or is bad, because we don't know how they thought like 10 years ago or 50 or 20 years ago. But the idea is here to start measuring yearly and see if we see any kind of improvement in terms of this perception. If you can pass. So one thing that is very important to realize is that, of course, talking about investments, more than 80%, at least 87% believe that the companies are unable to plan in long term in Brazil. This affects the idea of investment in Brazil. If we could reduce that, for sure we could have like a better environment for investments in Brazil. We in this panel, in this organizations, we basically organize in three big themes. One is legal predictability and consistency, and here we can say that like more than 80% also believe that laws are not applied fairly and equally to all. So this is an important data as well. If you can pass, and then of course, if anyone wants to have the access of this research, we can send to anyone. 50% believes that the judiciary validates breach of contract. This is also a perception, because in my point of view, this is not exactly true, like in a rule, but people feel that the judiciary validates breach of contract.
Do you agree with the respondents' view that court decisions are neither consistent nor predictable? And it's been the case that now for a long time, arbitration has been favored over litigation. Is it still the case that one should try to stay away from the court system and choose arbitration when possible?
Thank you, Amadeo, and good morning to all. And congratulations to Jota, I think, for this comprehensive, and I think you got the result that you got that reflects, I think, perception, right? And perception and reality are two things that walk hand in hand. You cannot not deal with perception. So a typical lawyer answer, right? I'm not saying yes or no, but what I think I can tell you is that it would be unfair to give a yes answer. You cannot generalize. You cannot say that Brazilian courts are not consistent and predictable in general. That said, and there have been, I think, many progress done by the Brazilian judiciary over the years with external control done via the CNJ. You have the creation of business specialized chambers in many states that deal, again, in a specialized way with business cases. You have an impressive reduction, even if we still have a large number of cases, dozens of millions of cases submitted to Brazilian jurisdictions. There has been an important decrease over the years via many mechanisms, technology, and also decisions that are binding, which was something that was not familiar to our system. And today we have binding decisions that really eliminate a very large number of cases. That said, so why we have this perception, right? And I think there are a number of reasons to which I think one would not disagree with. I think the first one is that, and I'll put that aside, we are living, and we heard this earlier today, a very politicized moment that affects courts. So courts in Brazil, the Supreme Court, has been taking a lot of decisions, controversial decisions that affect politics in general. And so people in the world today of antagonism are pro or against, and this affects the perception over the court system as well. But I think focusing on business and focusing on certainty for business coming from courts, I think the main issue remains time. Courts tend still to take a long time to solve disputes. And so you're talking about over 10, 12, 15 years in some cases, which of course creates a lot of instability for any business. And in this point, I want to give a word of praise here to the initiative of Minister Bruno Dantas that really in infrastructure is changing the scenario of that via the CSEX consensus, because in the past, in infrastructure disputes, you would have parties afraid of settling, the public agents afraid of settling, even if they knew that settlement would be the best solution for the country and for the case. And now I had the honor to participate in a very large case involving the telecommunication sector. We would have arbitration in disputes for over 10 years, and in less than a year, in a very well-conducted negotiation, TCU solved that, a case of dozens of billions of dollars. And again, I think this is something that brings hope, and it's really something to praise.
Thank you, Amadeo. Thanks for the chamber. It's great to see so many of you here, especially some old friends. A lot of what I would say has a historical perspective, because I've been here, as you said, for over 30 years. I started my career in Brazil. I do think, first, that stability of the legal system is very important. But I also have to say that I truly believe, looking throughout the years from afar, the Brazil fares fairly well. I have to say, when I compare with other countries in Latin America, when I compare with European countries, yes, we have up and downs. There are issues here and there, but a lot of the things that Eduardo have raised, I have examples in the US. Timing is one that is very interesting, because when I started at Troyjo, my boss at the time was very unhappy with a litigation matter in Brazil because it was taking too long. We had a different case litigation matter in the US, and it took exactly the same time. The matter in Brazil was a lot more complicated, and it ended very well for us. The matter in the US was very simple. It took the same amount of time, and it didn't went well for us. So for every example that someone has negative about Brazil, I will bring an example negative about any other place that I've worked on. So stepping back a little bit, and again, I'm still, and you can see I'm wearing the Brazilian colors. I'm Brazilian, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And looking back at my days working in Brazil, coming here in the 80s to work at the Brazil debt restructuring, and staying here for all these years and working not only with Brazil, but in the US and other countries. I am, and I feel very strongly, that the Brazilian institutions have improved significantly. And the court system has improved. A lot of my colleagues from UERJ that graduated with me, they became judges, they became prominent lawyers, and they're incredible people. They're well-trained, they're serious, they're honest, and I'm proud to be of what I consider the class of UERJ 1984. In fact, one of our professors became now a Supreme Court justice, and we're very close to him, curiously. I do think that the court system, again, is reliable. We say the same thing in the US. You never know when you bring a case to court. You never know how a judge will decide. It's human nature. There are odd cases here and there in Brazil, but also here and in other countries. I do think that the regulatory system has improved significantly. It's fairly stable, and you need reforms. It's an ongoing process. The laws should change. Decisions should change. I'm a big believer in the progress of everything, and I think Brazil has progressed in the right direction. And again, it's a true democracy, and there is a balance of powers that works, and other places are now working as well. But we mentioned perception is very important. So investors will invest more when Brazil is popular, will invest less when Brazil is less popular. My view from afar is that there is a gap in that perception. I do think Brazil, like other countries, is never as good or as bad as portrayed in the media. So I always give a 10, 20% discount. I get very excited when all is good, but you have to give a discount. And others have discussed the cost, the tax cost, their labor costs in doing business in Brazil. But they're there, and hopefully with new reforms, those will come down. Lastly, again, I have to say, personally, I have been invested in Brazil all these years, and our group also has been in Brazil for over 50 years. And we ride the waves, and we're very happy, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amadeo. Thank you, the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor to be here. I have to say that the views that I express here are my own, not my company's. So going back, I think there are a few laws that Brazil enacted in the past 15 years that made a huge difference for people who work with government affairs or in the legal field in Brazil. First one that I want to highlight, 2011, the Transparency Law. That law was a huge advancement in Brazil and allowed citizens to have access to public information and required the government to publish certain information. So that, I think, was the first step. And then let's go forward about 10 years. I want to share with you a little bit of my experience. I don't know if you know, but in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, Brazil signed an agreement with the US, a trade agreement. Wait a minute, it's not a free trade agreement. It's a limited scope agreement with 3 chapters, one on anti-corruption, one on good regulatory practices, and one on trade facilitation. I work very closely. I was at the US Chamber of Commerce in DC. I worked closely with both governments in the middle of a pandemic, and they did sign an agreement that had several commitments on the part of Brazil regarding good regulatory practices. And what is GRP? We call it GRP, good regulatory practice. Are rules and policies that should be implemented whenever an entity in the government decides to develop a new regulation. So there is a manual. You should do 1, 2, 3. And 1 is probably an impact assessment. You're going to create a new regulation. You need to analyze the impact in the citizens, in the industry, in the government. So impact assessment is 1. And that was a commitment that was written in the agreement that was signed by Brazil. The other one is public consultation. If you are proposing a regulation, you should offer the opportunity to the public to submit comments about the proposed regulations. And that was also in the agreement. So after that, 2022, Brazil enacted a law that implemented the commitments of the agreement. So that was also a great advancement. 2023, Brazil created the Secretary of Competitiveness and Regulatory Practices under the umbrella of the Commerce Department. Also a new secretary to promote good regulatory practice, to train the regulators, and to raise awareness within the population about the importance of good regulatory practices. And just about 8 months ago, 2024, Brazil enacted a law that launched the National Strategy for Good Regulatory Practices. So I do look back and I see a lot of progress in Brazil. I think we need to give credit where credit is due. I work very closely with the executive and the legislative branches. I see, I use a lot the websites of the ministries. They're very complete. There's a lot of information about pending legislation. There is one website where you can find public consultations that are available for the public to comment on. And I see that Brazil is a step ahead, a big step ahead compared to other Latin American countries in that respect. I feel secure because I know I'm going to find the information I want for my Brazil issues. I don't feel that secure about other countries in Latin America.
If there is one word that defines this moment, it's uncertainty, a theme we have already heard much about this morning. What's unusual today is that this uncertainty is not primarily about Brazil, as it is often the case when we meet, but about the United States. And it's not due to a sudden crisis, though that risk remains, but rather stems from questions around U.S. policymaking and its institutional environment. This is truly exceptional, because the United States sits at the center of the global economic system. Its uncertainty reverberates worldwide, shaping the outlook for Brazil. Ironically, due to Brazil's relatively closed economy and its own misguided protectionist policies, now echoed in the United States, the country may be somewhat shielded from the full force of these global shocks and could even, to a limited extent, benefit from the aftershocks. That said, while a weaker US dollar has provided some relief, Brazil faces its own set of challenges. With declining presidential approval and elections looming in 2026, the administration has pressed ahead with fiscal promises, including a proposed change to the income tax regime that threatens revenues and the already tight primary surplus target. This would be less concerning if not for the mounting public debt, expected to reach 80% of GDP by year end. To combat inflation, the central bank has embarked on a tightening cycle, pushing real interest rates on public debt above 7%. Thus, the interest rate burden now stands at 8% of GDP, among the highest globally. And as expected, contractionary monetary policy is weighing on economic activity. While growth remains relatively robust for now, unemployment is likely to rise, posing new challenges for the president's approval rating and together on his ability to lead his unwieldy and weak coalition.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Drauzio, for this amazing invitation. It's truly a pleasure to be in this very prestigious event. It's my first time, and it's truly a pleasure. So I'll start by reminding our audience that 2024 was actually the fourth year in a row in which Brazil surprised on the upside when it comes to growth. Just to give you some numbers, both the central bank at the turn of 23 to 24, I was still at the central bank at the time, as well as most economic analysts expected Brazilian growth to be around 2% in 2024, and we actually got 3.4%. And Brazil has held throughout the post-pandemic years very robust and resilient consumption throughout all this time. So it's no surprise to also see that the unemployment rate fell to the lowest levels in over 20 years, and we have been seeing, especially in 2024 and the beginning of 2025, still a heated labor market with real income growth. So consumption continues to be well supported into the beginning of 2025. But one of the major takeaways I would like to convey to you is that 2025 will be a year of a deceleration in growth. Majorly because of the weight of interest rates, as Paulo just mentioned. And I'll get to that in a bit. But I would like to underscore that we will see a very stark difference between the first half of the year and the second half of the year. Well, the first half is bound to remain supported by the 7.4% increase in the minimum wage that we saw in January, and also the bumper harvest, which was harvested in the first quarter, as well as the still robust labor market I just mentioned. We see a strong deceleration over the second half of the year as high interest rates bite and credit becomes a lot more scarce. We are already seeing banks pulling back on credit, reviewing downwards their guidances for credit growth, as would be expected. One thing that I always like to point out is that, differently from Mexico, which is bound towards a recession because of the sheer uncertainty, the sheer weight of the uncertainty it's leaving right now, in Brazil, this is a very standard textbook business cycle management by the central bank. So while hardly a situation we would like to be in, the kind of interest rate levels we are seeing, it's still it's a very standard business cycle management to proceed through in the next couple of years. An outcome of the consistently strong consumption growth that we have seen in this past 3 years is the acceleration of inflation. So this is the less shiny part of this strong outcome we have seen over the past few years in Brazil. It is this acceleration of inflation that is driving the central bank to reverse course and increase rates since September 2024. And what happened in inflation in Brazil was, first, the reversal of some of the drivers that had been helping on the disinflation part since 2023, which are mainly industrial goods and food inflation. Actually, food inflation has become a big villain for the decline in the president's approval ratings. But also industrials on the back of this depreciation of the BRL that we saw throughout 2024. And the second driver for inflation going up comes from services, which reflect this heated labor market. The services sector is the biggest part of GDP, and it's very labor intensive. This labor intensive feature helps to explain why the labor market has been so heated, and it reflects on services prices being pressured and actually accelerating as we ended 2024 and enter 2025. On the back of this developments, we see inflation accelerating from 4.8% at the close of 2024 to 5.6% this year. These are levels way above the 3% target that the central bank has for inflation. So you can see the challenge that the central bank has, particularly taking into account that inflation expectations are very unanchored in Brazil. If we look at the Focus survey, which is a weekly survey from market experts on inflation and GDP forecasts, the Focus survey sees inflation at 4% in 2027 and 3.8% in 2028. And this reflects, and from my point of view, not only the doubt surrounding fiscal consolidation in Brazil, but also still some lingering lack of credibility on the side of the central bank.
Well, hi everyone. It's a really, really big pleasure to be here with you today in this panel with great professionals. So thank you for the opportunity. So I was asked to discuss the fiscal policy, and first of all, the picture is indeed very concerning. As Paulo has already mentioned, we're talking about debt to GDP close to 80%, which is really high compared to emerging countries, and it is on a rise, and one cannot see stability in a foreseeable future. It depends a lot on the developments in next years to come. So it's important to mention that we are running with a balanced budget, but many lots of spendings are not included in the target. So actually, in structural terms, I would say we're running with a deficit. And Brazil needs a primary surplus of around 2% of GDP to stabilize the debt. So it's a big jump that we need, a big effort that it's needed for the upcoming governments. Well, spending review is needed. It has been carried out by the government, especially on some social policies, but it's far from being enough to stabilize that to GDP. We need to remember that around 90 and 95% of the budget of the spending is committed to mandatory spending. And most of it is related to constitutional rights. So we need to change constitution. It's not really easy to cut spending in Brazil. The best you can do is to change constitution in order to reduce the speed of spending increase. Aside from that, mandatory spending grows automatically in Brazil due to demographics, putting pressure in pensions, due to the fact that around 75% of spending is somehow linked to minimum wage or to inflation or to revenue. So it turns things much more difficult. The fiscal adjustment is really difficult in Brazil. That said, my main message here is that Brazil, this is an effort not for only one president. This is something that should be embraced for the next president. So Brazil needs to put the fiscal consolidation at the center of the political agenda. The idea is not to fix the fiscal policy rapidly, but to nurture the confidence, the expectation that fiscal consolidation is on track. Well, aside from these indicators, Brazilian government is suffering from a crisis of confidence in the fiscal sphere, which was a reflection of many of their options, of their choices. So the sharp increase in spending the adoption of measures that increase the rigidity of the budget, so the portion of mandatory spending with an increasing trend, and it has to do mostly with the new rule for adjusting minimum wage. And also another element here that eroded confidence is the use of quasi-fiscal policy. So putting everything together, we see a situation of a crisis of confidence. But I think it's important to mention that on top of that, of these decisions, there was, in my opinion, a wrong diagnosis on how to fix the fiscal policy. The idea that the government could recover some revenue, eliminating some tax distortions. They are present in Brazil, but the idea that this would be enough to comply with the rules embedded in the new fiscal regime and to meet the fiscal targets that were promised. So it was, in my opinion, a wrong diagnosis. Not to mention that there is a reaction from several segments in the private sector to higher taxation. So it has political implications, meaning that this adjustment via higher taxation would be technically incorrect, as spending is growing automatically, but also faces several reactions from the private sector. Well, last year there was this recognition from the government that they needed also to refrain the increase in spending. But the problem is that, well, that was good news. It was not a government that was doubling the bet on more measures or reducing or changing the fiscal target. It was not that. There was this recognition that they needed to control spending. But when it came too late and too small. And aside from that, the announcement of those measures to reduce the increase of spending, not to reduce the spending, but the increase of spending, it came along with the announcement of lower income taxation on middle classes. So the markets interpret that correctly as a populistic approach, and it feared again the confidence of the government. Despite this ugly picture, the big challenge is, I think, that we need to remember that society gave support to labor reform, pension reform, tax reform in the past. We didn't see strikes and protests, or at least not relevant ones. There was disapproval from society. Reforms have been approved since 2016. With different presidents approving reforms. This is an important achievement in Brazil. Of course, it needs to gain momentum. I see a more mature society, a society that refuses high inflation, a society that desires lower taxation. Well, the nod is from politics, but we see a more competition in politics, which is good news. I think one challenge here is to reduce this polarization, because this high polarization, of course, hinders reforms, and Brazil needs to be more ambitious. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Paulo, and thank you, the Chamber, for having me here. It's a pleasure. So let me start my comments by alluding to something that we've been hearing here this morning, since the keynote address, when Marcos Troyjo was talking about the importance of the tax reform and why this is really crucial in light of the comments of my other distinguished colleagues. I think the critical problem that we really have in Brazil is a fiscal problem, because now the government policy in place is not enough to stabilize debt to GDP. Whatever happens,
this year or next year, before the election or the next government term, will not, work towards debt stabilization. Of course, we've had an increasing debt on average that wasn't very different from other emerging market economies during the pandemic, but nevertheless, here we are with debt increasing towards the 90% level. And that is a problem because, as Fernanda, my colleague, was saying, we are on a sort of standard business cycle management issue. We do have rates at 15% and staying at 15% for a while to be able to bring inflation down. And that's really not a healthy outcome. And so I think the focus right now from the investor community is very much moving to, as early as now, or even, from a few months ago, towards the next government, the next term, the next president. And this is because the political cost to actually address the structural aspects of this fiscal problem are very large. And only a new government that can unify the political class and can really have a mandate and clarity of vision that there needs to be structural changes to this problem will be able to put these changes forward. So I think investors are pretty much even dismissive of slight slippages, let me put it that way, on the fiscal side this year, as long as, of course, there is observance, Brazilian way observance of the fiscal targets, of the spending rules, etc. But I think investors, my sense at least, is that they are willing to overlook that because that's done. Nobody believes that the fiscal picture here will improve. And in fact, one of the few consensus that I think out there is that push comes to shove, yes, there will be a slowdown in the economy, but there could be more stimulus to actually prevent a greater slowdown. So I think the consensus is growth needs to be present going into the election. So if there's a need for more social benefits, if there's a need to change the fiscal parameters of the spending cap or even the target, which is not the base case, but the suspicion is there. There's a lack of confidence, as Zaina was saying, which is a lack of credibility, really, in this government, with the release of savings that they have been doing, and it's very hard to estimate impact. Now, banks can, lend consumers using this modality, a new modality of private payroll lending, and it's good that it's bringing interest rates for consumers down, which are, by the way, 400% on average on an annual basis. But it's more stimulus into the economy. So the only consensus out there right now is really that growth will not collapse. There will be a very gradual slowdown, because that's what's needed really for an electoral result from an incumbent administration that's very competitive. We're going to be hearing from Felipe very soon on this matter. But just to mention that this fiscal problem is at the heart of the constraints and the high interest rate, the market volatility. We saw the Brazilian real really take a hit late last year when the fiscal announcements were not as what they were expected, and I think only the new government, and I think in speaking of these new elections, there is really a rally that we're fortunate to have some new blood in terms of presidential candidates. candidate. So I think there's a bit of an optimism that such a person exists right now, is electable. That's the governor of São Paulo. But there isn't certainty of the path ahead, that he will be the candidate, that he will be the winner. And so, until then, we are in this odd period where interest rates are very high, the economy is slowing, but not slowing very much. Inflation, is one variable out there where I think there is no consensus. The range that I hear from estimates this year, next year of inflation is really a wide range from 4.5% to 7%. There are locals that do believe inflation will stay at 6% this year, next year, maybe 7%. So just to give you a sense, it's a complicated situation. But as Paulo also mentioned, there is a little bit of a rescue from the external side, in the sense that we have a global scenario that might be able to help Brazil muddle through. We were talking earlier about a global rebalancing away from China, but in the very short term, there's also a little bit of a global rebalancing away from U.S. assets, and I think more expectations of perhaps dollar weakness. Of course, in a worse equilibrium, as Fernanda was saying, because, the prospect of lower global growth or a recessionary environment in the United States, or the lack of exceptionalism, all of that is a big deal. Big deal, excuse me. But for EM investors, when you look at Brazil in this context, it is a little bit more insulated from tariffs, from the tariff discussions. It is also a relatively, closed economy, large economy with a large domestic market, with very important global companies that are profitable and have good prospects ahead. So I think, there are many uncertainties, but to me, the picture is one of a muddling through picture, waiting for this new period of elections. And the bottlenecks that are implied by the current fiscal framework will force a fiscal adjustment, no matter which government comes in place. The room, as Zena was explaining, for discretionary spending will shrink and shrink, and that will create a crisis requiring a change in the fiscal framework after the election. So there needs to be a fiscal plan that also stabilizes debt to GDP.
Thank you so much, Paulo. It's always a pleasure to be here again. I would say that we are dealing now in Brazil with a very complex situation, a very strange equilibrium from the three branches of power in Brazil. So we have this idea that Lula's government is basically dealing with short-term initiatives in order to get his popularity back. He is not thinking about, like Zena was saying, structural discussions or change in the fiscal framework in order to get a more sustainable path for Brazil. And I think this is, in the origins, basically a lack of communication between what Haddad is saying, what the market is saying. So Haddad always talks, when he talks about fiscal, about the primary surplus, ignoring totally that what the market is worried in this moment is the trajectory of debt to GDP. And we are also living in a moment in which we have the bigger distance, ideological distance between a president and the Congress profile in the recent story of Brazil. So we have a president that's center-left, more left this time than he was in his first terms, and we have a Congress that is center-right, and they are very different, and if you analyze the parties, they all supported Bolsonaro in 2022. So usually people ask me why they don't get more in a opposition spectrum against Lula. And I would say that because somehow they are partners. We never had a stronger parliament as we have right now. They control basically like a huge part of the discretionary budget in Brazil. And they, in order to have that money accessible, which is very important in their political way to re-elections and so on, they need to see the fiscal target reached by the executive government. So they don't have the incentives to go against Lula because they don't like him, because if they go totally against Lula, they might damage the government, which can backfire against them. So they don't, if you ask me, okay, they are very ideological and all, they are ready to support Tarcísio, for instance. If they believe that Lula is still a strong candidate in 2026, they won't leave Lula by his own. So because they don't have this interest, they want to be part of the power in that moment. And then we arrive a little bit in the moment. Lula has a strong ally in the Brazilian institution, which is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is basically validating a lot of cases that can help Lula and Haddad in their revenue strategy that Zeno was talking. Basically, they ignore the fact that they needed to cut spending, and they are totally 100% depositing their hopes in getting more revenues. And that's a huge problem as well, because it's also not structural revenues. There are non-recurrent revenues that are coming from specific cases, and that we won't be able to model that for the medium and long term. This is a huge problem. And you ask me, okay, but the parliament is against the Supreme Court. Sure, it is against the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court is also responsible for the criminal cases against the House of Representatives and the senators, and there's at least 40 cases in criminal cases against House of Representatives and Senator ongoing, which makes them all trying to reach this awkward equilibrium in which nobody likes anyone, but everybody needs to work together in order to get their revenue.
We have a lot to talk about, and we don't have much time. I will shift to a much faster pace to get our speakers' reactions rather than involved thoughts, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow to start with, right? So actually, I know one person who knows, but is out of scope. So let's just stay with what we have. It is a very harsh reminder that economics is hostage to politics, and what we have in scope as far as politics go here is quite significant and can have a very, very damaging implications, very, I think, broad implications for what comes next. And we are not pricing this one scenario or the other. I know Claudia talked about pricing scenarios here, and then no one is pricing inflation of 6% in Brazil. It is either 4 or 10, right? We're assigning probabilities to what's going to happen. And what's in scope in the U.S.? We see those changes in politics every 50 years or so, or rearrangement systems. Was Bretton Woods, is Reagan, Thatcher, we are going through some reversal of this. So we don't know, a lot at stake. And we look at the probabilities of recession that we can back out from markets. They're very moderate. Normally, credit markets do a much better job at doing that. They're pricing something moderate. But again, no one really knows, and the spectrum is quite wide. So you have to take this and what we'll discuss as probabilities that we assign to one or the other. They, of course, can be managed. We know how to manage this in the U.S. Cut fiscal deficit, tax more consumption than savings, and things will realign. But it's more than that, as I said, it's a politics. Brazil is in a not as easy a situation as countries like Mexico. For example, Mexico has no alternatives, so close to the U.S. It has to realign with the U.S. to go through Scott Besant's buckets. There's allies, enemies, and people in the middle. Of course, Brazil will be in the middle, given that it's not that close to the U.S. and is closer to China than the U.S. would like to see. So that interferes a lot with the outlook for policy making in Brazil as well. So external drivers are very, very important now. Fernanda, starting with you, you talked about the hurdles the central bank faces, but we have this big elephant in the room. So the quick question for you is, markets are pricing 50 basis points. In which scenario do you think Brazil and the central bank can get away with 50 basis points in the long hold?
Thanks, Geraldo. Well, I'm afraid they can't. Actually, from everything I've mentioned previously, I don't think the BCB has the luxury of reacting strongly to external environments, given how most of the drivers in our current inflation problem are domestic. So we have an accelerating inflation problem. We have an asymmetric balance of risks, which the central bank itself is saying tilted to the upside, meaning the risks are tilted towards more inflation rather than less. So what I do think is that developments abroad have given the central bank some comfort that their current strategy of reaching 15 and staying on hold has a bigger chance of having some success. This was being questioned very strongly by the local community, and I think they got this improvement in their chances. Still, not going towards 15, I think, would be very damaging for central bank credibility, given that even with 15% interest rates on hold until the end of the year, the central bank model itself, the central bank forecasts are not at 3% by the middle of 2027. So that shows that you have to at least get to 15%. And given all the perils and uncertainty and the domestic drivers we have been discussing here in this panel, they will have to be at that level for a pretty large amount of time.
One big component of those policies was fiscal. Last November, basically we were told that macro stability was secondary, politics at the helm. We had that debt crisis moment, and they're still paying for that. So now we are discussing U.S. Fiscal problems, etc., tariffs, and we're not paying that much attention to Brazil. But do you see over the next quarters, let's say, ahead of elections, another November moment when people or the candidates face the fiscal challenges and they don't come through reassuring enough?
Well, I think that there was kind of a learning curve for the government after all the turmoil last year. I think they tend to be more cautious from now on. Which doesn't mean that we're not gonna see extra measures to improve the approval of the government, populistic measures, but I would not put much weight on that. What it's not clear for me is how it's going to be. So there is this learning curve. I think that high inflation is high interest rates. They somehow help to reduce this excesses from the government. What is far from clear, regardless of who is going to be the candidates, is how the fiscal debate will develop. My understanding is that, well, I think that there is a big chance that actually Haddad could be, Prime Minister Haddad could be the candidate actually, but the point is, being candidate or not, he needs to improve his credibility. So, as already mentioned, today Haddad would not win elections, so I think that reinforcing not only the commitment to the fiscal targets, but the recognition that reforms are needed. This is something that he needs to say. This government needs to say that reforms are needed. Pension reform will be needed. And all these measures, that's reforms that needs to be carried out regarding social policies, that would help to reinforce the confidence and the fears of a possible re-election. So, of course, it's difficult to have an outlook for that. We're talking about a very uncertain scenario. But so far, I could say that the government now, or the fiscal stance now, is different from the beginning of last year. I think that all the criticism, all the market reactions helps to curb, a government that will double the debt, as I mentioned.
And I know you like rates in Brazil, but with inflation maybe going up, do you see this as a tactical move? Do you see there's additional legs that can become a structural repricing of rates in the years to come, assuming that growth is not going to be getting any better here and there? What's your take on structural versus tactical reasons to be investing in Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, there are different types of investors. For fixed income investors, certainly you can say valuations are rather attractive. It's, very high real rates. And the central bank, as we heard from Fernanda, is basically doesn't have any choice but to hike to 15, even if it's not enough to bring inflation to the target and stay there. So we are at peak rates, and that's when I think investors perhaps look to add positions in local bonds, and also in an environment where the currency appears to have found its range. Nevertheless, there are many other types of investors, and I wanted just to make mention here of the climate-related investments that are happening in Brazil, and I think have legs beyond the election. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, there is certainly room for a lot of scale. We normally speak of the National Development Bank as one provider of funds for the public sector, but they are also there's also an arm of the bank that is very much intermediating innovative solutions in the climate space with companies, innovative companies, in partnership with other global leaders, and intermediating the needs of capital for these companies with private sector investors in the financial sector. So there have been a lot of project calls to expose again those projects to the financiers, including, perhaps us here in the room, and that's a very interesting thing that's happening in Brazil. So, this idea of the private sector excuse me, scope for an increase in investments with the public sector intermediation, and including some multilaterals. IDB Invest, for example, wants to become the bigger part of the IDB Development Bank, so it's a lot more private sector leaning and project oriented. So these things exist, right? And the corporates, as I mentioned, are, you know, in healthy shape. And there's also scope for that. Lastly, when we think about sovereign bonds, you know, valuations are generally very, very tight. But they are smaller, you know, than the tied to ratings, but they are smaller than they were. So I think vis-a-vis the peers. So there's also opportunities there to be had. So it's not a matter of being out of Brazil, but it's a matter of the scale and of looking, you know, prospectively. Of where we're going to land in terms of the structural issue. Thank you.
We shouldn't forget that Brazil often competes with countries like Turkey. You know what happened in Turkey. And I was in Europe seeing a bunch of those investors, the traditional ones, and yeah, they're looking to Brazil, if anything, because of what happens elsewhere and because of how attractive rates are. Will Lula win by walkover? Because I don't see a candidate in the opposition. So the more I hear from, including you, is that there's no clear candidate in the opposition. Will we have one?
Yeah, I think that is the $1 million question, because, of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but that's the main challenge for the center-right. It's not that Lula is competitive because of his merits. No, he's competitive because of the lack of alternatives, both in the left side and in the right side, the inability that we've been seeing of unifying a vision, an alternative vision that can present it against what Lula is doing in his third term right now. So I would say that it's difficult to say because we still have a lot of time. I think that the population is tired, the polarization is true, and inflation takes even more seriously the way that the population in Brazil sees the government. So if the inflation is go under control and Lula is not able to recover his approval rates the way the former presidents did, we would have for sure discussions about should Lula run and have the risk of losing in his last election. So I would say that those are the variables that they are considering. But for now, he is in a better shape than their alternatives, because Tarcísio, why would he leave his chair in the government of São Paulo, that he would be able to be fairly re-elected in next year, in order to go to an election that first he will need to go against Bolsonaro family, and then he will need to go against Lula. So it's a very tough for him, and that's why by now he's saying that, no, I'm not doing that, please stop talking about this and all. This changes a lot, and that's why the approval rate in March 2025 will be very important to see, because that will make him, if Lula is not recovering, if Lula's popularity is going down, if the inflation is going up, and Tarcísio sees an opportunity, maybe there in March 2025 we would see, we will have more.
2026.
26, exactly. 26, we're gonna see for sure if he will be able to leave his office to go against Lula.
This has been an excellent discussion. I just would like to remind you all that the best we can hope right now is that in the next election, somehow seriously the political class begins to address the issue of fiscal structural reform, that somehow that gets put into the platform. So let's keep hoping for that. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm sorry for being overrun. We'll close the program.
Thanks everybody for sticking with us. Thanks again to White & Case for the invitation and for us overextending our welcome here for a few minutes, but I think the discussion was great. Unfortunately, when you get economics and politics mixed together, everybody wants to talk about the politics, and then this could go on for a few more hours. But I want to thank this panel. It was a great panel. Thank Amadeo for the first panel as well. I think we have perception versus reality in both. In the first one, the perception that Brazil's legal system is not as strong as it actually is. And in the second one, I think the perception is that the economy is doing well because we're still seeing growth, but it's very localized. And the reality is that 50% interest rates will hurt, and will hurt most sectors in Brazil. So we need to fix this, as Paulo eloquently said here at the end. Again, on behalf of the Chamber, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been a pleasure to see a lot of friends and a lot of new faces here as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the next events, including a small little one next month, the Person of the Year dinner. Thanks very much.